The marble floor beneath my feet felt cold even through my worn shoes as I stood beside Richard Hartwell, the man who had raised me for 23 years but never once called me daughter. The Grand Meridian Hotel's opulent lobby buzzed with the quiet conversations of wealthy guests, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. I clutched my single worn duffel bag, feeling every stare that lingered on my second-hand dress and scuffed boots. "Documents," the reception clerk said with practiced professionalism, though her eyes flicked between Richard's tailored suit and my shabby appearance with barely concealed confusion. Richard slid an elegant leather folder across the polished counter, his movements precise and cold. "Richard Hartwell, I have the penthouse suite reserved." His voice carried the authority of old money, the kind that opened doors and silenced questions. The clerk's manicured fingers danced across her keyboard. "Yes, Mr. Hartwell, we have you confirmed for the penthouse suite." Her gaze shifted to me uncertainly. "And for the young lady?" The silence stretched like a blade across my throat. I watched Richard's jaw tighten, saw the familiar muscle twitch that preceded his cruelest moments. When he finally spoke, each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of humiliation that spread through my chest. "She's not family," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. "Put her in the servants' room." The words hit me like physical blows, but I had learned long ago not to flinch. Not in public, not where it would embarrass him further. The clerk's fingers froze above her keyboard, her professional smile wavering. Behind us, conversations quieted as elegant heads turned our way, curiosity replacing politeness. "Sir, I'm not sure we have," the clerk began. "You heard me." Richard's pale blue eyes never left mine, and in them I saw something that went beyond mere disappointment or frustration. It was contempt, pure and cold, the kind reserved for things considered beneath notice. "She's staff, treat her accordingly." My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I wondered if others could hear it. The shame burned in my cheeks, but I forced myself to stand straighter. I had survived 23 years of Richard's calculated cruelty. I could survive this. Around us, whispers began, hushed speculations about the well-dressed man and the poorly dressed girl he claimed as servant rather than kin. The clerk looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to challenge a guest who could afford the penthouse. Her training warred with her instincts, and I watched her lose the battle. I'll need to check what rooms are available in the service quarters." Just as her fingers moved toward the phone, another voice cut through the tension like warm honey over sharp edges. "Mr. Hartwell." We turned to see a distinguished man in his 50s approaching, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit impeccable, but somehow more approachable than Richard's cold elegance. His dark eyes held intelligence and something else, recognition. "I'm James Morrison, the hotel manager." He extended his hand to Richard, but his gaze lingered on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "I wanted to personally ensure your stay meets our highest standards." Richard shook the offered hand, his political smile sliding into place. "Of course, though I'm afraid there's been some confusion about accommodations for my—" He paused, letting the silence stretch deliberately. "Ward." "No confusion at all," Morrison said smoothly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, the paper thick and expensive. The hotel's gold seal caught the light as he turned it over in his hands. "In fact, I have something that might interest you both." Something in his tone made the hair on my arms stand up. Richard's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, but I caught it. Morrison's fingers worked the envelope open with deliberate care. The sound seemed amplified in the suddenly quiet lobby. He withdrew a document, unfolded it, and his eyes found mine across the paper. "Emily Catherine Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble expanse. The lobby fell silent, completely, utterly silent. Even the subtle background music seemed to pause. My name hung in the air, like a question that demanded an answer, and every eye in the vicinity fixed on me with new attention. But it was Richard's face that captured my full attention. The blood had drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale as the marble beneath our feet. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. His confident posture crumbled, shoulders sagging as if he'd taken a physical blow. For the first time in my life, I saw Richard Hartwell, the man who had controlled every aspect of my existence, completely paralyzed. Morrison's eyes never left mine as he continued. "Miss Hartwell, I believe it's time we discussed your inheritance." The word inheritance echoed in my mind as Morrison gestured toward a private office behind the reception area. My legs felt unsteady, as if the marble floor had turned to quicksand beneath my feet. Richard remained frozen at the counter, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen him display: shock, fear, and something that looked almost like panic. "This way, please," Morrison said gently, his hand hovering near my elbow without quite touching. The gesture was protective, respectful, so different from Richard's commanding grip that had guided me through life like a prisoner being led to cells. As we walked toward the office, memories flooded back with painful clarity. I was 7 again, sitting in Richard's study while he explained that my mother had been unstable and that I was lucky he'd chosen to keep me despite the complications of my birth. I remembered asking what complications, and the way his eyes had hardened like winter ice. "Your mother was a troubled woman, Emily," he'd said, his voice taking on that tone reserved for discussing unpleasant necessities. "Mentally ill. She abandoned you when you were barely 2 years old. If not for my generosity, you would have ended up in the system." Even at 7, I'd sensed there was more to the story. But children believe what they're told, especially when they have no other choice. Over the years, whenever I'd asked about my mother, her name, what she looked like, where she'd gone, Richard would grow cold and distant, implying that my questions were ungrateful and inappropriate. Morrison's office was elegant, but warm, with deep leather chairs and walls lined with books. He closed the door behind us, and suddenly the hotel's grand lobby felt a world away. I noticed Richard hadn't followed us, a fact that sent another tremor of unease through my chest. "Please sit," Morrison said, settling behind his desk. The envelope lay between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. "I imagine this is overwhelming." "I don't understand," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "What inheritance? My mother abandoned me. Richard told me she had nothing, was nothing." Morrison's expression grew gentle but sad. "Emily, how much do you know about Catherine Blackwood?" The name hit me like a physical blow. "Who?" "Your mother, Catherine Blackwood Hartwell." He opened the envelope and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the desk like tarot cards revealing a hidden future. "She didn't abandon you, Emily. She died when you were 3 years old." The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting a wave of dizziness. That's not possible." Richard said she left. He said she was mentally ill and couldn't take care of me. "Catherine Blackwood was one of the wealthiest heiresses on the East Coast," Morrison continued, his voice steady but kind. "She inherited the Blackwood shipping fortune from her father when she was 25. When she married Richard, she was worth approximately $50 million. The numbers meant nothing to me. They were too large, too impossible to connect to the woman I'd imagined as my unstable, abandoning mother. Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Morrison leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Because 3 days ago, I received a call from Catherine's lawyer, a man named Harold Pemberton who's been searching for you for 20 years. It seems your mother left very specific instructions in her will, instructions that Richard has been ignoring." My mind reeled back to childhood moments that suddenly took on new meaning. The way Richard would sometimes stare at me with that strange mixture of resentment and calculation. How he'd insisted I never take his last name legally, always referring to me as his ward rather than his daughter. The expensive private schools followed by his refusal to pay for college, claiming I needed to earn my way like everyone else. "She left you everything, Emily," Morrison said softly. "The entire Blackwood estate. But there were conditions. You had to be found, had to be told the truth about her death, and you had to claim your inheritance before your 24th birthday." I stared at him, the words bouncing off my consciousness like rain on stone. "My 24th birthday is next month." "I know." He pushed one of the documents toward me. "Harold Pemberton has been looking for you for decades, but every trail led to dead ends. Richard told everyone you'd died in the same accident as your mother. He collected death benefits, closed accounts, and essentially erased you from the Blackwood family tree. The betrayal cut deeper than any of Richard's daily cruelties. All those years of being told I was lucky he kept me, that I owed him everything, that I was nothing without his charity. All those years of feeling like an unwanted burden, a mistake he was too noble to abandon. "But how did you find me?" I whispered. Morrison smiled, and for the first time since entering his office, I saw warmth in his expression. "Your mother was very clever. She suspected Richard might try to manipulate the situation after her death, so she set up what she called insurance policies. She had private investigators she trusted, people who would continue looking even if something happened to her primary lawyer." He pulled out a photograph, old, with the slightly faded quality of pictures from the early 2000s. The woman in it had my dark hair, my green eyes, but her face was open and joyful in a way mine had never learned to be. She was holding a toddler with chubby cheeks and bright, curious eyes. "This is you and your mother, taken about 6 months before she died." I touched the photograph with trembling fingers. The little girl in the picture looked loved, cherished. Her clothes were expensive, her smile confident. She looked nothing like the burden Richard had always made me feel I was. "How did she die?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Morrison's expression darkened. "According to the official report, it was a car accident. Single vehicle, late at night, poor weather conditions." He paused, choosing his words carefully. But Catherine had hired a private investigator shortly before her death. She suspected Richard was planning something. The investigator's notes were concerning. What kind of concerning? The kind that suggests your mother's death might not have been as accidental as everyone believed. The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I couldn't see but could definitely smell. Murder. Morrison hadn't said the word, but it echoed in the silence anyway, bouncing off the office walls and settling into my bones with a chill that had nothing to do with the hotel's air conditioning. You're saying Richard killed my mother? The words felt foreign in my mouth, too large and sharp for my tongue to handle properly. Morrison's hands folded over the documents spread across his desk. I'm saying Catherine believed she was in danger, and she took precautions. Smart precautions, as it turns out. He pulled another paper from the envelope, this one covered in my mother's handwriting, loops and curves that looked eerily similar to my own. She wrote detailed letters, sealed them with her lawyer, with instructions they only be opened if something happened to her. I leaned forward, trying to read the upside-down text. What do they say? That Richard had been pressuring her to change her will, that he'd become increasingly controlling and violent, that she'd discovered he had gambling debts, far exceeding what she'd known about when they married. Morrison's finger traced along a line of text, and that she feared for both her life and yours, if she didn't find a way to protect you both. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in. I thought about all the times Richard had gripped my arm too tightly when I'd disappointed him, the way his anger could turn cold and calculating rather than hot and explosive. Had my mother seen that same darkness in him? The inheritance, I said, needing to focus on something concrete, something I could understand. What exactly did she leave me? Morrison smiled, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been admiration in his expression. Catherine Blackwood was not just wealthy, Emily. She was brilliant. The Blackwood shipping empire was built by her grandfather, but she's the one who modernized it, diversified it, turned it into something that could survive economic downturns and industry changes. He opened a leather portfolio and spread out documents that looked official and intimidating. Stock certificates, property deeds, bank statements with numbers that made my eyes water. The liquid assets alone are worth approximately $78 million as of last month, Morrison continued. But there's also the shipping company, 3 properties in Manhattan, a house in the Hamptons, and significant investments in tech companies that have appreciated considerably since her death. I stared at the papers, but the numbers seemed to swim before my eyes. How much total? Conservative estimate? $150 million. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush me. I'd spent my entire adult life working minimum wage jobs, wearing secondhand clothes, eating ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I cared to admit. I'd been denied a college education because Richard claimed I needed to understand the value of work. I'd been made to feel grateful for a roof over my head and food on the table, and all the while, I'd been one of the wealthiest heiresses in New York. Why didn't she divorce him? The question came out harsher than I'd intended. If she knew he was dangerous, if she suspected he might hurt us, why didn't she just leave? Morrison's expression grew complicated. According to her letters, she tried, but Richard had leverage, photos, documents, things that could have destroyed her reputation and her business relationships. She was trapped, but she was fighting back the only way she could. By making sure I'd inherit everything, by making sure you'd inherit everything, and by making sure there would be consequences if anything happened to her. He pulled out another document, this one thick and official looking. She also left instructions for a full investigation into her death if you were ever found and claimed your inheritance. My head was spinning. An investigation? After 20 years? Money talks, Emily, and Catherine left enough money to ensure that the right people would listen, even decades later. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying my face. The question is, what do you want to do with this information? Before I could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the office. Morrison frowned, checking his watch. I'm not expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Morrison rose and moved to the door, opening it just far enough to speak with whoever waited outside. I heard muffled voices, one of which sounded familiar and angry. Sir, he's very insistent, came a woman's voice. The clerk from the front desk, I realized. Tell Mr. Hartwell that I'll be with him shortly, Morrison replied, but the door pushed open before he could close it. Richard stepped into the office, his face flushed with anger and something else. Desperation, maybe, or fear. His eyes immediately found the document spread across Morrison's desk, and I watched his expression shift from fury to cold calculation. I see you've been filling Emily's head with stories, he said, his voice controlled but tight. I hope you understand the legal ramifications of interfering in family matters. Family matters? Morrison stepped back into the room, positioning himself slightly between Richard and me. I was under the impression that Emily wasn't family. Didn't you just inform my staff that she was to be treated as a servant? The barb hit its mark. Richard's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure. Emily has always been difficult, prone to flights of fancy, just like her mother. I've spent 20 years trying to provide stability, structure. You've spent 20 years stealing her inheritance, Morrison interrupted, his professional courtesy finally cracking. 20 years lying to her about her mother's death, about her identity, about everything that mattered. Richard's eyes flicked to me, and I saw something in them I'd never noticed before. Not just contempt, but fear. He was afraid of me, or rather, he was afraid of what I might become now that I knew the truth. Emily, he said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of paternal disappointment. Surely you don't believe these wild stories, after everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed. Stop. The word came out stronger than I'd expected, cutting through his manipulation like a blade through silk. Just stop talking. For the first time in my life, Richard Hartwell fell silent when I told him to. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with 23 years of suppressed truth. Richard's face underwent a transformation I'd never witnessed, the careful mask of paternal authority cracking to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. His hands, always so steady when delivering punishment or disappointment, trembled slightly as he reached for the documents scattered across Morrison's desk. "You don't understand what you're doing, Emily," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that made my skin crawl. It was worse than his anger, this sudden vulnerability. It felt like manipulation wrapped in desperation. These people, they're filling your head with fantasies. Your mother was sick, Emily, paranoid. She saw conspiracies everywhere. Morrison moved smoothly to gather the papers before Richard could reach them. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private meeting." "Private?" Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter. "She's been my responsibility for over 20 years. Everything she is, everything she's become, is because of my guidance, my sacrifice. You think you can waltz in here with some papers and undo 2 decades of what?" I stood up so quickly that my chair rolled backward. 2 decades of what, Richard? Of telling me I was worthless? Of making me feel grateful for scraps when you were stealing millions that belonged to me? His face went white, then flushed red. Stealing? I saved you from a life in foster care. I clothed you, fed you, educated you. With my mother's money. The words exploded out of me, 23 years of suppressed rage finally finding their voice. You used my inheritance to raise me like a charity case, made me feel like I owed you everything when you were the one stealing from me. Richard stepped toward me, his hand raised, and for a moment I was 7 years old again, cowering before his anger. But then Morrison's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Hartwell, I strongly suggest you control yourself. We have security cameras in this office, and any threatening behavior toward Miss Blackwood will be documented and reported to the authorities." Richard's hand froze mid-gesture. Miss Blackwood. Not Emily, not his ward, but Miss Blackwood. A name that carried weight, power, and most importantly, legal rights he couldn't control. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," Richard said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than his shouts. "Catherine was sick, Emily. The paranoia, the delusions about being followed, about me wanting to hurt her. It was all in her head. The doctors confirmed it." "What doctors?" Morrison asked sharply. Richard's eyes flicked between us, and I caught something, a moment of panic before he recovered. "Her psychiatrist, Dr. Pembroke. He treated her for months before the accident. He'll tell you. She was having a complete mental breakdown." Morrison made a note on a pad of paper. "Dr. Pembroke. We'll be sure to contact him during our investigation." "Investigation?" Richard's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Into Catherine's death," Morrison said calmly. "As per her will's instructions, a full forensic review of the accident, the circumstances leading up to it, and anyone who might have benefited from her death." I watched Richard's face cycle through emotions: fear, anger, calculation, and finally, cold rage. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that familiar tone of absolute authority that had controlled my life for so long. "Emily, you're coming with me. Now. This nonsense has gone on long enough." "No." The word came out quiet, but firm. "I'm not going anywhere with you." His eyes widened as if I'd struck him. In all our years together, I had never directly defied him. I had been sullen, resentful, quietly rebellious, but never openly defiant, never willing to face the consequences of complete refusal. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." I felt something shifting inside my chest, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. I said, "No, I'm not going with you. I'm not going back to your house. I'm not going back to being your ward, or your servant, or whatever convenient fiction you've been using to control me." Richard's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked almost like respect. But it was the wrong kind of respect. The kind a predator gives to prey that suddenly shone fangs. "I see. Well then." He straightened his jacket with sharp, precise movements. "I suppose you think you're quite clever now, don't you? Armed with your inheritance and your new friends who promise you the world." He turned to Morrison, and his smile was cold enough to freeze blood. I hope you've done your due diligence, Mr. Morrison, because Emily has a history of mental instability, just like her mother. It runs in families, you know. The courts might find it very interesting that a hotel manager with no legal credentials is encouraging a mentally unstable young woman to make major financial decisions. The threat was subtle, but clear. Richard was already planning his next move, already figuring out how to discredit me, how to maintain control. For a moment, the old fear crept back in, the familiar terror of disappointing him, of facing his anger, of being abandoned completely. Then Morrison spoke, his voice calm and professional. Mr. Hartwell, are you threatening my client? Because I should mention that Miss Blackwood's inheritance includes not just money, but also some very interesting personal papers, letters, diary entries, photographs, some of them quite revealing about her marriage to you. Richard went very, very still. What kind of photographs? Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade, the kind that might be of great interest to the district attorney's office, especially when combined with financial records showing unusual money transfers in the months before Catherine's death. The office fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard stared at Morrison for a long moment, then at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but genuine hatred. When he spoke, his voice was soft and controlled, but it carried the promise of violence. You have no idea what you're starting, Emily. No idea at all, but you will. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. I could hear his footsteps echoing across the marble lobby, sharp and rhythmic, like a countdown to something terrible. Morrison closed the door and turned back to me, his expression concerned but determined. Emily, I think you need to understand. This is just the beginning. Richard isn't going to give up easily. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. What do I do now? Now? Morrison smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, it was a warm, genuine expression. Now we make sure you're safe, we get you the best lawyers money can buy, and we find out exactly what happened to your mother. The next morning, I woke up in a suite that cost more per night than I usually made in a month. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden rectangles across Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's cars. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through everything Morrison had told me, every revelation rewriting my understanding of my own life. The knock on my door came precisely at 9 o'clock. I opened it to find a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that screamed expensive lawyer. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark eyes assessed me with the kind of sharp intelligence that missed nothing. Miss Blackwood? I'm Margaret Chen, senior partner at Chen, Morrison & Associates. Her handshake was firm, professional, but not unkind. James Morrison called me yesterday evening. I believe we need to talk. I'd never had a lawyer before, had never needed one, never been able to afford one. Margaret Chen looked like the kind of attorney who charged more per hour than I'd ever seen in a single paycheck. Please come in, I said, stepping back to let her into the suite. I'm sorry, I don't really know how this works. I've never had a situation like this before. Margaret's expression softened slightly as she settled into one of the suite's elegant chairs. First things first, you don't need to apologize for not understanding legal proceedings. That's what I'm here for. Second, everything we discuss is protected by attorney-client privilege. Richard can't force me to reveal anything you tell me. The relief that washed over me was profound. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt like I could breathe freely. Morrison said there might be evidence that Richard killed my mother. There might be. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. I spent most of last night reviewing the materials Harold Pemberton gathered over the years, along with the private investigation Catherine commissioned before her death. The picture that emerges is disturbing. She spread several photographs across the coffee table between us. They showed Richard in various locations, restaurants, bars, what looked like a private club. In several of them, he was with other people, men in expensive suits who somehow looked dangerous despite their wealth. Your mother's private investigator documented Richard's gambling habits extensively, Margaret continued. But it wasn't just gambling. He was involved with some very unsavory people, loan sharks, money launderers, individuals with connections to organized crime. I stared at the photos, trying to reconcile the men in expensive suits with my image of criminals. How much did he owe? At the time of Catherine's death, approximately $12 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $12 million. But he always acted like money was tight, like we had to be careful about expenses. Classic behavior for someone drowning in debt. He was using Catherine's money to pay the interest on his loans, but the principal kept growing. According to the investigator's notes, several of Richard's creditors had begun making threats. Not just financial threats, physical ones. Margaret pulled out another document, this one handwritten in what I now recognized as my mother's writing. Catherine wrote this letter 3 days before she died. She'd discovered the full extent of Richard's debts, and had decided to divorce him and cut him off financially. She was planning to take you and disappear. New identities, new life, somewhere he couldn't find you. I picked up the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was hurried, desperate, but clear. If something happens to me, Richard did it. I've found the receipts, the photographs, the evidence of what he owes and who he owes it to. He knows I know. He's been different lately, cold, calculating, watching me like I'm a problem to be solved. I've arranged for Emily to be taken care of, but I'm running out of time. He's planning something. I can feel it. Asterisk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. She knew. She knew he was going to kill her. The evidence suggests she suspected it, yes, but suspecting and proving are two different things in court. Margaret leaned forward, her expression intense. Emily, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. The car accident that killed your mother? The police report mentions brake failure, but the mechanic who examined the car afterward noted that the brake lines look like they might have been tampered with. Might have been? The damage was too extensive to be certain, but combined with everything else, Richard's debts, his behavior, Catherine's fears, it creates a compelling circumstantial case. I set the letter down carefully, afraid I might tear it with my shaking hands. What happens now? Now we do several things simultaneously. First, we secure your inheritance. Richard will try to challenge the will, claim you're mentally incompetent, anything to maintain control. Second, we petition to have your mother's case reopened as a potential homicide. And third, Margaret paused, her expression growing serious, we make sure you're safe. Safe from what? From Richard. Men who kill once often find it easier the second time, especially when they're desperate. And Emily, Richard is very desperate right now. As if summoned by her words, my phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but I recognized the tone immediately. You're making a terrible mistake. Meet me at Riverside Cafe at 2 p.m. if you want to discuss this like adults. Come alone, or face the consequences of your childish rebellion. Asterisk. Margaret read the message over my shoulder, her jaw tightening. We're not doing that. He'll be angry if I don't show up. He'll be angry regardless. The question is whether you're going to keep letting his anger control your decisions. Margaret's voice was firm but not unkind. Emily, you need to understand something. The dynamic between you and Richard, that's not a normal father-daughter relationship. That's an abuser and his victim. He's conditioned you to fear his anger, to prioritize his feelings over your own safety. The words stung because they rang true. How many times had I swallowed my own needs, my own desires, to avoid Richard's displeasure? How many opportunities had I missed? How many dreams had I buried because disappointing him felt like a fate worse than death? What should I do about the message? Nothing. Let me handle Richard from now on. All communication goes through me. Margaret pulled out her business card and wrote something on the back. This is my personal cell number. If he contacts you directly, if he shows up anywhere you are, if you feel threatened in any way, you call me immediately. I pocketed the card, feeling simultaneously protected and terrified. He's not going to give up easily. No, he's not. Men like Richard don't surrender power voluntarily. But Emily, you have something now that you never had before. What's that? Margaret smiled, and it was fierce and predatory in the best possible way. You have resources. You have allies. And most importantly, you have the truth on your side. Richard has been playing this game with a marked deck for 20 years. It's time to shuffle the cards. 3 days later, I stood in front of a modest office building in downtown Manhattan, staring at the brass nameplate that read Harold Pemberton, Attorney at Law. Margaret had arranged this meeting, explaining that Harold had been my mother's lawyer and the executor of her will, the man who'd spent 20 years searching for me, while Richard convinced the world I was dead. The waiting room was old-fashioned but comfortable, filled with leather-bound books and the kind of heavy wooden furniture that suggested both permanence and respectability. Harold Pemberton himself was in his 70s, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Dear God," he whispered, "you look just like her." He pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his eyes, and I realized this wasn't just professional for him. He'd cared about my mother personally. "Miss Blackwood, Emily, I can't tell you how long I've waited for this day." He gestured toward his office, his hands shaking slightly with emotion. "I have so much to show you, so much your mother wanted you to know." His office was a shrine to Catherine Blackwood. Photographs covered every surface. Catherine as a child, as a young woman, at her wedding to Richard. But it was the more recent photos that caught my attention. Catherine holding a toddler with dark curls and bright green eyes, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "She loved you so much," Harold said, settling behind his desk. "You were the light of her life, Emily. Even when things got dark with Richard, talking about you always made her smile." "Tell me about the missing years," I said. Morrison said you've been looking for me for 20 years. How did Richard hide me so completely? Harold's expression darkened. Richard Hartwell is a very clever man, and he had advantages I didn't. He had legal guardianship, he had your mother's money at his disposal, and he had connections in places I couldn't reach. He pulled out a thick file, but he also underestimated your mother's foresight. The file contained hundreds of documents, correspondence, financial records, private investigator reports, and what looked like a detailed timeline spanning 2 decades. Catherine knew Richard would try to hide you, Harold continued, spreading out a map marked with red pins. So she created what she called a breadcrumb trail, small, seemingly insignificant records that would eventually lead to you. Bank accounts opened in your name but never used, medical records filed under your birth name, even a trust fund for your education that Richard never knew existed. I studied the timeline, seeing my life laid out in fragments, school enrollment records, medical appointments, even photographs taken from a distance. You were watching me all these years? Not watching, searching. Every few months we'd get a lead. Emily Hartwell enrolled at St. Catherine's Academy. Emily Hartwell treated for a broken arm at Mount Sinai. Emily Hartwell applied for a job at a bookstore in Brooklyn. Harold's finger traced the red pins on the map. But every time we got close, the trail would go cold. Richard was very good at moving you around, changing schools, even changing your last name back and forth between Hartwell and other variations. He told me it was for legal reasons, I said, remembering the confusion of never knowing which name to use on official documents. He was covering his tracks, making it nearly impossible for us to establish a pattern. Harold pulled out another photograph, this one showing me at about 16, walking out of a school I barely remembered. This was taken 3 months before your mother's money would have automatically transferred to you under the original will terms. What original terms? Catherine initially set up the inheritance to transfer when you turned 18, but she changed it in her final amendment, moved it to 24, with additional safeguards. Harold's eyes met mine. She suspected Richard might try to claim you were mentally incompetent if he couldn't maintain control past your 18th birthday. The manipulation ran even deeper than I'd imagined. So he kept me isolated, dependent, made me feel like I couldn't survive without him. Classic psychological abuse. And legally, it worked. You never tried to leave him, never questioned his authority, never sought help. Harold's voice was gentle but firm. You were conditioned to believe you had no other options. I thought about all the times I'd considered running away, especially in my late teens. But Richard had been so good at making me feel incapable, so skilled at convincing me that the world outside his protection was dangerous and hostile. Even my few attempts at independence, jobs, friendships, romantic relationships, had been systematically undermined by his subtle interference. How did you finally find me? Harold smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Technology caught up with Richard's methods. Facial recognition software, digital records, social media cross-referencing. Your mother left money specifically for updated search methods as they became available. Last month, a routine search flagged your employment records at the coffee shop where you worked, he corrected himself. And Morrison? James Morrison's family owned this hotel when your parents stayed here for their honeymoon. His father was the manager then, and he remembered Catherine. Remembered how frightened she seemed during what should have been a happy time. Harold leaned back in his chair. When James inherited the hotel, he also inherited his father's suspicions about Richard. He's been one of our most dedicated allies in the search. I felt overwhelmed by the network of people who had been looking for me, fighting for me, while I'd been living as Richard's captive without even knowing it. What about Richard's story that I was dead? He filed falsified death certificates for both you and Catherine, claiming you died in the same accident. But he was sloppy, used different dates, different hospitals, different coroners. Anyone who looked closely would have seen the inconsistencies. Harold's expression hardened. The question is why no one looked closely for so long. Money, intimidation, and Richard's political connections. He's been very careful to cultivate relationships with judges, prosecutors, police officials, people who might ask uncomfortable questions. Harold pulled out another file, this one marked confidential. But your mother prepared for that too. Inside the file were photographs that made my blood run cold. Richard with men I didn't recognize, but who looked dangerous. Richard exchanging envelopes in parking garages, in restaurants, in places that screamed illegal activity, and financial records showing large cash withdrawals from Catherine's accounts in the months before her death. She documented everything, Harold said quietly. Every suspicious meeting, every unusual financial transaction, every threat Richard made. She knew she was running out of time, but she was determined to protect you, even after her death. I stared at a photograph of Richard, handing a briefcase to a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. This was taken 3 days before the accident. 2 days, and Emily, Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That man Richard is meeting with, his name is Vincent Torino. He's currently serving a life sentence for murder, but at the time, he was known as one of New York's most efficient contract killers. The office seemed to spin around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting a wave of nausea. He hired someone to kill her. We believe so. The FBI has been interested in Vincent Torino for years, but they could never make the charges stick. If we can prove Richard hired him to kill Catherine, we can prove Richard murdered my mother. Exactly. Harold leaned forward, his eyes intense. Emily, what I'm about to ask you is dangerous, but it might be our only chance to get justice for Catherine and to make sure Richard can never hurt anyone else. I met his gaze steadily, feeling something hard and determined settling in my chest. For 23 years, I'd been Richard's victim. It was time to become something else entirely. What do you need me to do? The courthouse steps felt like a mountain I was being asked to climb in heels. Margaret Chen stood beside me, her presence both comforting and intimidating in her perfectly tailored power suit. Behind us, a small army of lawyers from her firm carried boxes of evidence, 20 years of carefully documented proof that Richard Hartwell was not the grieving widower and devoted guardian he'd pretended to be. Remember, Margaret said, her voice low and calm, you don't have to prove anything today. That's my job. Your job is simply to tell the truth. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity, lawyers conferring with clients, families clustered on benches, the constant flow of people seeking justice or trying to avoid it. And there, across the marble expanse, stood Richard. He looked older than he had just a week ago, his face drawn and pale, but his posture was still erect, still commanding, and when our eyes met across the lobby, I saw no remorse, no shame, only cold, calculating anger. He was flanked by his own legal team, expensive lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. Emily, Margaret touched my arm gently. Are you ready? The hearing was to determine the validity of my mother's will and my right to claim the Blackwood inheritance. Richard's lawyers were arguing that I was mentally incompetent, that I'd been brainwashed by unscrupulous individuals seeking to exploit a vulnerable young woman. They painted me as a confused, unstable person who couldn't possibly manage a vast fortune. It would have worked 6 months ago. The old Emily, Richard's Emily, would have wilted under their assault, would have believed their characterization of her as weak and incapable. But that Emily had died in Morrison's office when I learned the truth about my mother. Miss Blackwood, the judge said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Would you please tell the court in your own words about your relationship with Mr. Hartwell? I stood, my hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. Your Honor, for 23 years, I believed Richard Hartwell was my guardian and benefactor. I believed my mother had abandoned me, that I was lucky he'd chosen to care for me despite my being a burden. I believed I owed him everything. Richard's lawyer started to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. I now know, I continued, my voice growing stronger, that every single thing he told me was a lie. My mother didn't abandon me. She died protecting me. I wasn't a burden. I was an heiress, whose inheritance he stole to pay his gambling debts and fund his criminal activities. And I didn't owe him gratitude. He owed me a childhood, a mother, and a truth he spent decades hiding. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. I could feel Richard's eyes burning into me, but I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, drawing strength from her attentive, intelligent expression. Can you describe the conditions of your upbringing, Miss Blackwood? This was the hard part. Margaret had prepared me, but admitting the depth of the psychological abuse felt like stripping naked in public. Richard controlled every aspect of my life, where I went to school, who I could befriend, what jobs I could take. He moved me frequently, claiming it was for my own good but actually ensuring I never formed lasting relationships or stable connections that might lead to questions about my past. I took a breath, steadying myself. He used fear as his primary tool. Fear of disappointing him, fear of being abandoned, fear that I couldn't survive without his protection. He made me believe I was fundamentally flawed, that my mother had left because something was wrong with me. Objection! Richard's lead attorney shot to his feet. The plaintiff is clearly coached testimony designed to— Overruled, the judge said sharply. The witness is answering my direct question about her personal experiences. Continue, Miss Blackwood. He denied me a college education, claiming I needed to learn the value of work. He monitored my relationships, sabotaging any romantic connection or close friendship that might threaten his control. He made me work minimum wage jobs while living in luxury funded by my own inheritance. My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed through. Most damaging of all, he stole my mother's memory, making me believe she was mentally ill and worthless when she was actually brilliant, loving, and brave enough to try to save me from him. When I sat down, The courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Then Margaret rose for the next phase, presenting the evidence. The documents were devastating. Financial records showing Richard using Catherine's money for gambling debts, luxury purchases, and payments to criminal associates. Private investigator reports documenting his associations with loan sharks and potential contract killers. Medical records proving Catherine had never been treated by the psychiatrist Richard claimed had documented her mental illness, because that psychiatrist didn't exist. But the most damaging evidence came from Catherine herself. Margaret played audio recordings my mother had made in the weeks before her death, her voice clear and steady as she documented her fears. Richard came home late again last night, and I could smell alcohol and cigarettes. And something else. Fear, maybe. Desperation. He's in deeper than I thought, and the men he owes money to aren't the kind who accept payment plans. I found a gun in his desk drawer today. Richard doesn't hunt, doesn't collect weapons. The only reason a man like Richard buys a gun is if he's planning to use it. Asterisk. The recording sent a chill through the courtroom. Even Richard's lawyers looked uncomfortable as Catherine's voice continued from beyond the grave. I've changed my will again, added more safeguards for Emily. If something happens to me, when something happens to me, she'll be protected. She'll have allies, resources, people who will fight for her even if I can't. Richard thinks he's cleverer than everyone else, but he's not clever enough to fool a dead woman who spent months preparing for her own murder. Asterisk. The judge called a recess, and I watched Richard's face as the courtroom cleared. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly defeated. Not angry, not calculating, not planning his next move, just defeated. Margaret squeezed my shoulder as we gathered our things. Emily, you did brilliantly. I think we've got him. But as we walked toward the exit, I caught sight of Richard conferring intensely with one of his lawyers. The defeated expression was gone, replaced by something that looked like desperate determination. Whatever he was planning, it wasn't surrender. Margaret, I said quietly, I don't think this is over. She followed my gaze to Richard's huddle and her expression darkened. No, she agreed. I don't think it is either. Men like Richard don't go down without taking everyone they can with them. The call came at 3 a.m, jolting me from restless sleep. Margaret's voice was tense, professional, but underneath I could hear something that might have been fear. Emily, I need you to listen very carefully. Don't panic, but you need to leave the hotel immediately. Harold Pemberton's office was broken into tonight. Nothing was stolen, but his files were searched, and there's evidence someone was looking specifically for information about you. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Richard? We don't know yet, but given the timing, right after the hearing, it seems likely. I'm sending a car to pick you up. Pack only essentials and meet the driver in the hotel's service entrance in 15 minutes. Where am I going? Somewhere safe. I'll explain everything when I see you. The next few hours passed in a blur of unfamiliar faces and urgent conversations conducted in whispers. Margaret had arranged for me to stay in a safe house, a nondescript apartment in Queens that felt like something from a witness protection program. 2 bodyguards, both former FBI agents, took shifts watching the entrances. This is about more than your inheritance now, Margaret explained as we sat around the apartment's small kitchen table. Harold's contacts at the FBI think Richard has been involved in money laundering for organized crime families for years. Your mother's murder might have been just the beginning. She spread out photographs and documents across the table. Surveillance photos of Richard meeting with men who looked like movie villains. Financial records showing millions of dollars moving through accounts connected to various criminal enterprises. And most damning of all, a recording that made my blood turn to ice. This was captured 3 days ago by an FBI wiretap on one of Richard's associates, Margaret said, pressing play on a digital recorder. Richard's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. The girl is becoming a problem. She knows too much, and she's not backing down like I expected. We need to handle this before the investigation goes any deeper. Another voice, rougher and with a slight accent. Handle it how? However necessary. Make it look like an accident, just like with Catherine. I can't afford to have Emily talking to federal investigators. The recording clicked off, leaving silence that felt heavy enough to crush me. Richard, the man who had raised me, fed me, clothed me, was planning to have me killed just as he'd killed my mother. How long do I have? I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. We don't know, but Emily, there's something else. Margaret's expression was grave. The FBI wants to offer you a deal. They'll provide protection, but in exchange, they want you to help them build a case against Richard and his criminal associates. What kind of help? They want you to wear a wire, meet with Richard, get him to confess, provide evidence of his criminal activities. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intense. It would be dangerous, extremely dangerous, but it might be the only way to stop him permanently. I thought about my mother, about the woman in those photographs who had been so vibrant and alive, so determined to protect me that she'd documented her own murder in advance. I thought about all the years I'd spent feeling grateful to Richard for keeping me, never knowing that he'd killed the person who loved me most. What would I have to do? The next day, I found myself in a windowless room at Federal Plaza, being briefed by agents who looked like they'd stepped out of a television crime drama. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, I learned, was the lead investigator on what they called Operation Bloodline. Richard Hartwell has been on our radar for 8 years, she explained, showing me photographs of Richard with various criminals. We've suspected him of laundering money for 3 different crime families, but he's been too clever to leave direct evidence. Until he got desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and Richard is making a lot of them lately. Agent Chen pulled up audio files on her computer. We've been monitoring his communications for the past week. He's planning something big, not just your murder, but what looks like a major money transfer out of the country. If he succeeds, he'll disappear completely, and we'll lose our chance to take down a network that's been responsible for dozens of murders and millions in illegal profits. She turned to face me directly. Emily, I won't lie to you. What we're asking is dangerous. Richard has already killed once to protect his secrets. He won't hesitate to kill again. But if I don't do it, then he might disappear, and other people will die. People whose only crime is knowing too much about Richard Hartwell's business. Agent Chen's expression softened slightly. The choice is yours. No one will think less of you if you decide the risk is too great. I stared at the photographs spread across the table. Richard shaking hands with murderers, counting money stained with blood, smiling as he planned the death of the woman who'd loved me. My mother had been brave enough to document her own murder to protect me. Could I be brave enough to finish what she'd started? What do you need me to do? The plan was elegantly simple and terrifyingly risky. I would contact Richard, tell him I'd reconsidered, that I wanted to make peace. I'd suggest meeting at a restaurant, somewhere public enough to feel safe but private enough for honest conversation. The restaurant would be wired with cameras and microphones, and agents would be positioned throughout the area. My job was to get Richard talking about my mother's death, about his criminal activities, about his plans for me. The wire I'd be wearing was nearly invisible, but if Richard suspected anything, if he searched me or became suspicious, don't think about that, Agent Chen advised as technicians fitted me with the recording equipment. Focus on your anger, on your need for justice. Richard destroyed your life, killed your mother, stole your inheritance. You're not just helping us build a case. You're fighting for your own life and your mother's memory. That evening, I stared at my reflection in the mirror of the safe house bathroom. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Strong, determined, dangerous, in her own quiet way. She looked like she could face down the man who had controlled and manipulated her for 23 years. She looked like Catherine Blackwood's daughter. I picked up my phone and dialed Richard's number, my hand steady, despite the gravity of what I was about to do. Richard, it's Emily. I think we need to talk. The restaurant Richard chose was exactly what I'd expected. Expensive, exclusive, the kind of place where wealthy men conducted business over meals that cost more than most people's rent. Luciano's occupied the top floor of a Manhattan high-rise, offering panoramic views of the city while maintaining the kind of intimate atmosphere where secrets could be shared without fear of eavesdropping. Or so Richard thought. I arrived 15 minutes early, as Agent Chen had instructed, giving the FBI surveillance team time to confirm their positions. The wire taped to my chest felt like it was burning against my skin, a constant reminder of the danger I was walking into. If Richard suspected anything, if he searched me or detected the recording equipment, I pushed the thought away and focused on the role I was playing. The confused, frightened young woman who had finally realized she was in over her head and wanted to return to the safety of Richard's control. It wasn't entirely acting. Part of me was terrified, but underneath the fear was something harder, colder, the determination to get justice for my mother. Richard was already seated when the maitre d' led me to his table, occupying a corner booth that provided privacy and clear sightlines to all entrances. He looked older than he had at the courthouse, stress lines etched deep around his eyes, but his smile was warm and paternal as he stood to greet me. "Emily, sweetheart," he said, opening his arms for an embrace. "I'm so glad you called." I forced myself to step into his arms, to accept the hug that felt like being embraced by a cobra. His cologne was the same as it had always been, expensive, subtle, and forever associated in my mind with fear and compliance. "I'm sorry," I said as we sat down, letting my voice shake slightly. "I'm so sorry, Richard. I got confused, scared. These lawyers, they filled my head with stories, and Shh. He reached across the table and patted my hand, the gesture so familiar it made my skin crawl. "It's all right, Emily. I understand. They're very good at what they do, these people who prey on vulnerable young women. They saw an opportunity, and they took it." The waiter appeared, and Richard ordered wine. Expensive wine, naturally, as if this were a celebration instead of what I hoped would be his confession to murder. "The important thing," Richard continued once we were alone again, "is that you've come to your senses. We can fix this, Emily. We can make it all go away and return to the way things were." "Can we?" I leaned forward, letting hope creep into my voice. "Really? Because those lawyers, they showed me documents, recordings. They said," I paused, as if the words were too difficult to speak. "They said you killed my mother." Richard's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, of assessment. He was deciding how much truth to tell me, how much I could handle while still remaining under his control. "Your mother was sick, Emily," he said finally. "Truly, genuinely sick in ways you were too young to understand. The paranoia, the delusions, the constant fear that everyone was plotting against her. She was having a complete breakdown. But the private investigator's reports, figments of a disturbed mind. Catherine hired that investigator because she was convinced I was having an affair, convinced I was stealing from her, convinced I was planning to hurt her. None of it was real, sweetheart. It was all in her head. The lie came so smoothly, with such practiced sincerity, that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I thought of my mother's voice on those recordings, clear and rational and terrifyingly accurate in her predictions. Then why did she die? I pressed. If she was just sick, why did the car accident happen? Richard sighed, and for a moment, his mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating underneath, something that looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be protected. Because she was driving while having a psychotic episode, Emily. She thought people were chasing her, thought she was in danger. She was driving too fast, lost control. He shrugged. It was tragic, but it wasn't anyone's fault. The brake lines were damaged in the crash. The investigators found exactly what you'd expect to find after a high-speed collision. Richard leaned back, studying my face carefully. "Emily, who's been telling you these stories? Margaret Chen? That hotel manager? They're using you, sweetheart. They want your mother's money, and they're willing to destroy both of us to get it." I felt the weight of the wire against my chest, the knowledge that every word was being recorded, that somewhere nearby FBI agents were listening to Richard lie about my mother's death with the same casual ease he'd shown for 23 years. "But what if they're right?" I whispered. "What if my mother really was in danger? What if someone did want to hurt her?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost gentle. "Emily, do you want to know the truth? The real truth about your mother's death?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Yes, she was going to leave me, take you and disappear, start over somewhere else. She'd found out about some business arrangements I'd made, debts I owed, and she was threatening to expose everything. Richard's eyes met mine, and in them I saw no remorse, no guilt, only cold pragmatism. I couldn't let that happen. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun. I stared at him, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. "So yes," Richard continued, his voice matter of fact, "I arranged for your mother to have an accident. It wasn't personal, Emily. It was just necessary. She was going to destroy everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. I couldn't allow that. You killed her." The words came out as a whisper. "I protected us. Protected you from a life of poverty and instability. Protected myself from men who would have done much worse than kill me if I couldn't pay my debts." Richard leaned forward, his expression almost paternal. "And I'll do it again if I have to, Emily. If you force my hand, if you continue down this path with these lawyers and their accusations, I'll have no choice but to protect us both." The threat was clear, unmistakable. Richard was telling me he'd killed my mother, and he was prepared to kill me too if I didn't return to his control. I thought of Agent Chen's words, asterisk focus on your anger, on your need for justice. "What about Vincent Torino?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Richard went very still. "How do you know that name?" "The FBI showed me photographs. You meeting with him, paying him, 2 days before my mother died." I leaned forward, feeling something fierce and powerful rising in my chest. "They have recordings, Richard. Wiretaps. They know everything." For the first time since I'd known him, Richard Hartwell looked truly afraid. "You're wearing a wire," he said, his voice flat and cold. It wasn't a question. I didn't bother to deny it. Richard stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket. "You stupid, stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Around the restaurant I caught subtle movements, men in suits shifting position, hands moving toward concealed weapons. The FBI surveillance team, preparing to move. "I did what my mother would have wanted," I said, standing to face him. "I got the truth, and now everyone's going to know what you really are." Richard's hand emerged from his jacket holding a small pistol, but before he could raise it, the restaurant erupted in controlled chaos. FBI agents appeared from every direction, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. "Richard Hartwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Blackwood and conspiracy to commit murder." Richard looked around at the agents surrounding him, then back at me. For just a moment, his mask fell away completely, and I saw him as he really was. A weak, desperate man who had spent decades covering his crimes with lies and violence. Then Agent Chen was beside me, her hand on my arm, leading me away from the scene as they cuffed Richard and read him his rights. "You did it, Emily," she said. "You got him." I looked back once as they led Richard away. He was staring at me, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been grudging respect. 23 years of control, of manipulation, of making me feel small and powerless. It was all over. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my mother's house in the Hamptons, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and pink. The house had been perfectly preserved, maintained by a trust fund my mother had established for exactly this purpose. Walking through it for the first time had been like stepping into a museum of the life I should have had. Photographs of me as a toddler, my nursery kept exactly as it was the day we'd left for the city, my mother's journals filled with dreams and plans for our future together. Richard was awaiting trial for first-degree murder, money laundering, and a dozen other charges. His lawyers had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was overwhelming. Not just the recording from our restaurant meeting, but 20 years of carefully documented criminal activity that the FBI had uncovered once they knew where to look. Vincent Torino had agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, finally providing the missing link that connected Richard directly to my mother's death. I'd testified before the grand jury, my voice steady as I recounted not just that final conversation, but 23 years of psychological abuse. The prosecutor called it one of the most compelling cases of long-term manipulation and control she'd ever seen. Richard's political connections couldn't save him this time. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many federal crimes for his influence to reach. Harold Pemberton had cried when I'd called to tell him about Richard's arrest. "Catherine would be so proud," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said you had her strength, even as a little girl. She knew you'd find your way home eventually." Home. The word still felt strange in my mouth, but increasingly right. The Hamptons house was beautiful, but it wasn't home. Not yet. Home was still something I was building, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, truth by truth. Margaret Chen had become more than my lawyer. She'd become a mentor and friend. She was helping me establish a foundation in my mother's name, focusing on helping young women escape abusive relationships and providing resources for those trapped in situations of control and manipulation. "Your mother's story isn't unique," Margaret had told me during one of our planning sessions. "There are thousands of women and men living under the control of people who claim to love them. Your foundation could be their way out." The Catherine Blackwood Foundation was set to launch next month, with a staff of lawyers, counselors, and investigators dedicated to helping people reclaim their lives from their abusers. It felt like the perfect way to honor my mother's memory, while building something meaningful from the wreckage of my own past. But perhaps the most important change wasn't in my bank account or my living situation. It was in me. The frightened, desperate young woman who had stood in that hotel lobby 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, her own power, her own capacity for courage in the face of danger. I'd started therapy to deal with the trauma of 23 years of psychological abuse. Dr. Sarah Winters was patient, kind, and utterly without judgment as I worked through the complicated grief of mourning a mother I barely remembered while celebrating the destruction of the man who had raised me. "Healing isn't linear," she'd told me during one particularly difficult session. "You're going to have good days and bad days, moments when you feel powerful and moments when you feel like that scared little girl again. That's normal. That's human." The bad days were still hard. Waking up from nightmares about Richard, moments of panic when I thought I heard his voice, waves of grief for all the years with my mother I'd lost. But the good days were becoming more frequent, and they were very, very good. Like today, like standing on my mother's deck, wearing her favorite silk robe that I'd found in her closet, drinking coffee from her favorite mug, and feeling her presence in the salt breeze and golden sunlight. My phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. "Coffee later? I have news about the documentary crew." I smiled. James Morrison had become an unexpected friend, his quiet strength and genuine care a balm after decades of Richard's manipulative protection. He'd helped me navigate the media attention that had followed Richard's arrest, the newspaper articles calling it the inheritance murder case, the television interviews, the book deal offers I'd politely declined. A documentary crew was working on a film about my story, but more importantly, about the broader issue of financial abuse and the systems that enabled men like Richard to maintain control over their victims. I'd agreed to participate not for the attention, but for the platform it would provide to help others recognize the signs of the kind of manipulation I'd lived under for so long. The morning was warming up, promising another beautiful autumn day. I had lunch plans with Margaret, a therapy appointment in the afternoon, and dinner with a group of women who'd reached out after hearing my story, survivors of their own abusive situations who'd found strength in our shared experiences. For the first time in my adult life, my schedule belonged to me. My choices were my own. My future was unwritten and full of possibility. As I finished my coffee, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small envelope tucked under a shell on the deck railing. The paper was weathered but still intact, and my name was written across it in my mother's handwriting. Inside, a single sentence: "Trust yourself, my darling girl. You are stronger than you know." I held the note to my chest, feeling tears prick at my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. My mother had known somehow that I would find my way here. She'd trusted that her elaborate preparations, her careful documentation, her love reaching across 20 years of separation, would eventually bring me home. The sun was fully up now, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered gold. Somewhere in that light, I felt my mother's approval, her pride, her joy that I'd finally claimed the life she'd died trying to give me. I was Emily Catherine Blackwood, daughter of Catherine Blackwood, survivor of Richard Hartwell, and for the first time in 23 years, I was exactly where I belonged, free.